So friends, the Baha'i Chair for Studies in Development at DAVV University Indore is pleased to welcome our distinguished panelists and the participants of this webinar who are joining us on Zoom and on Facebook Live. The theme of the webinar is Reassessing the Place of the Informal Sector in India's Development Story. This is the 11th webinar being organized by the Chair on the social and economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on India's marginalized populations. India has the world's largest informal sector, employing close to 400 million people. This sector includes small enterprises and unregistered laborers who remain below the threshold of government regulation and who are excluded from social protections, labor protections, job security, opportunities for economic advancement, and a voice in policy decisions that affect their lives. Those employed in this sector are engaged in a range of areas from manual labor and service provision in fields such as agriculture, construction, and domestic work, to street vendors and home-based workers producing goods and services for the market. Informal sector workers make a vital contribution to the Indian economy, contributing an estimated 55% of national earnings. By employing a large number of the socially and economically underprivileged in India, the sector helps prevent poverty and hunger. It contributes to the preservation of local culture and social life. Yet, despite their contributions under difficult conditions, informal sector workers are often misunderstood, undervalued, and stigmatized as the cause rather than the effect of low levels of development. Some of those who have analyzed this tendency to undervalue and stigmatize large sections of the informal sector have traced its links to various forms of discrimination embedded in India's social structure. During colonial rule in India, the city was divided into two sections: the planned formal section inhabited by the colonial rulers and the unplanned informal city of the native population. Among the legacies of such policies was the pattern of inclusion and exclusion which got embedded in dominant models of economic planning, labor organizing, and urban planning. All informal economic activity by the native population was treated with suspicion by the colonial state. Similarly, it has been argued that the stigma attached to the informal sector workers in India also has its roots in the deep-seated prejudice against those who work with their hands, such as artisans and service providers, in a caste-based society where such work is assigned to those on the lowest rungs of the caste hierarchy, while mental work remains the preserve of the upper caste groups. Yet the marginalization of informal sector workers was not just the result of these socio-cultural factors. It was also the outcome of distortions arising out of the attempt to view and describe India's economic and social realities through the lens of classical development thinking that based its norms and models on the experience of industrialization and modernization in the global north. Economic growth and industrial development was supposed to bring about a transformation of the structure of employment, with the movement of labor from agriculture to industrial and service jobs, out of informal self-employment to formal wage employment. Much of the informal sector that did not meet this norm was viewed as part of the traditional underdeveloped past that needed to be left behind. Over more than 7 decades of the application of these theories and models, the promised transition remains far from achieved. The formal economy in India today employs only 31.4 million people, while the informal economy continues to provide work to nearly 400 million. Many have pointed out that even the conceptual categories used by policymakers and academics are unsuited to understanding the dynamics of the informal sector. The concepts that are currently employed to describe and analyze the labor market take the idea of the formal enterprise transacting with other formal enterprises as the norm. The model of labor markets are largely based on the characteristics and dynamics of wage employment. Wage employment has been institutionalized to the exclusion of other forms of informal employment. The model of wage employment served also as the basis for the design of labor laws and social protections, which again excluded informal sector workers who were presumed to be not real workers with a claim to their own rights. Apart from calling for a better, more nuanced and granular reading of the reality of the informal sector, there has been an appeal for the recognition of their capacities and the contribution they make to the well-being of society. Among those clumped together as an aggregate in this sector are highly skilled artisans with their own dynamic and sophisticated systems of knowledge, which they refine and pass down through a system of apprenticeship. Many of those who form part of the informal sector are known to build and maintain strong social networks as a form of protection against risks. The sector includes micro-entrepreneurs who are known to be extremely resourceful, adaptive, and creative in their production processes. The highly localized and socially embedded nature of their work ensures that their economic activities are more likely to be responsive to local environmental, social, and cultural contexts and to strengthen existing social bonds and expressions of culture. While there is undoubtedly the need for improvements in the living and working conditions of informal sector workers, the question remains as to how their path of advancement can be paved based on an accurate reading of their realities and by building on their existing strengths, rather than destroying their knowledge systems, their values, and their cultural base in the name of modernization. How can their sense of agency be strengthened? How can they find a genuine voice in decision-making and policy-making processes rather than have their participation be reduced to a form of tokenism? These are some of the many questions that we hope to explore in the course of this webinar. Before I request our panelists to make their comments, I want to remind the participants that they can ask questions and share comments with the panelists through the Q&A box. You can type your comments or your questions and we will take them up. Our first panelist in this discussion is Professor Amit Basole. Amit is an associate professor at the Azim Premji University. I invite Amit to please share his comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Arash. Am I audible clearly? Okay. So thank you for the invitation, and I'm very happy to be here with these three other panelists, all of whose work I know, and I'm very much looking forward to listening to them. And you have also set up the whole, really the whole set of issues very nicely in your opening remarks, and in fact touched upon almost everything that I was planning to speak about. So let me maybe make some remarks for about 10 minutes or so, bringing in a lot of what you said, and drawing on the work that I have been doing for some years on the Banaras textile industry, as well as the more recent work that we have been doing here at the Center for Sustainable Employment at Azim Premji University. There will not be much COVID here. I realize it's a COVID series, but I'm really not going to be talking much about the pandemic. So let me start by, when you asked for a title, with apologies to Raymond Carver, I said, what do we talk about when we talk about the informal sector? And what I had in mind was precisely what your opening remarks showed, which is that depending on your entry point, your theoretical framework, your policy goal, you can talk about very, very different things and still be talking about the informal sector. So we need to understand why that is the case. Why can we sustain so many very different views on the informal sector? And is there a way to think about it in a coherent fashion? Obviously, I can't do all of this in 10 minutes. Neither do I have that understanding, but I'd like to think through it here with you and the audience. So I want to start by making a few conceptual distinctions, which will help us hold the discussion together, I hope. The first is the distinction between the informal sector and informal employment. And most people here will know that when we talk about informal employment, we also tend to include workers without job security or without benefits in the organized sector, what in India is called the organized sector, which immediately introduces a very key analytical concept in the debate, which is the question of scale. So how large is the unit of production or the scale of production? And as you mentioned in the beginning, for convenience reasons, policymakers have tended to exclude a very large amount of economic activity that is simply too small to effectively regulate in a poor country. And that really is all kinds of economic activity. It is the entire economy, as a matter of fact. So there's an entire economy that is too small to regulate and hence unorganized. That is the informal sector, while any number of workers who work in large factories in the organized sector, but who work without adequate protection or varying degrees of protection, are informal or varying degrees of informal or formal workers, which I'm not going to talk about. So that was the first distinction. The second distinction, when we talk about the informal sector, which also we can call the unorganized sector, which is the small scale part of the Indian economy, is the distinction between subsistence activity and capitalist activity. Analytically, this distinction is important because it is the subsistence part of the informal sector that is really the villain of the piece in the development story that you mentioned, the story of Lewis and Kuznets and many other people who have talked about structural transformation in developing countries or indeed in any country. The story is that development is synonymous with the disappearance of the subsistence sector and the emergence of the capitalist sector as the only way to do business, so to speak. This distinction is important for a couple of reasons. One, it clearly points to what we mean when we say development. We mean the development of the capitalist economy. And to the extent that policy fails to deliver that, and when I say development, I should be even more precise, it is the movement of workers, as you said, from the subsistence sector to the capitalist sector. If policy fails to move workers from the subsistence to the capitalist sector, it is failed policy as far as development policy making goes. And I'm making this very clear, even though we may not all agree with these definitions, just so that we know what the definitions are. That's the first reason why the subsistence sector has to be analytically distinguished from the capitalist sector. The second is that in the absence of adequate social security and in the absence of the modern state's inability to deliver social security, it is the subsistence sector that performs this role to a very, very large degree in India, and we saw this clearly in the COVID pandemic. So even as the subsistence sector reduces in importance, and I'll present some numbers to discuss whether in fact that has been happening or not, and you suggested that it has not been happening, perhaps. Even as it reduces in importance, its importance as a fallback sector, I think, will be with us for some time to come. And that's also a discussion we can have as to whether we are seeing a movement, in fact, in quite the opposite direction, which is that the government or the state, far from assuming more responsibilities to itself to offer social safety nets, is relying more and more on the existence of the informal sector to do that job for it. I won't be talking too much about this, but I wanted to bring up this point. Okay, so having set out these distinctions between the informal employment and informal sector and the subsistence and the capitalist parts of the informal sector, what do we know about the nature of the structural transition in India? Now, very quickly, I'll summarize some parts of some work that I did recently on just looking at where India stands vis-a-vis other countries in its structural transition story. Now, all of us think of India as having, quote, too many people in agriculture and, quote, too many people in the informal sector. The question is, what is too many? What is the expected number? And one simple answer to that statistically is the expected number or the proportion is what the average is given India's per capita GDP, the average globally, meaning in developing countries. And when you do that exercise and you find what is the expected agricultural share or informal share, you find a very clear answer. India has more or less the expected share of people in agriculture for how poor it is, but it has far more than the expected share of informal sector, even controlling for how poor it is. So we have been to an extent successful in moving people out of agriculture. What we haven't been successful in doing is moving them into large scale or capitalist economic activity. Instead, they have mostly been in going from one kind of subsistence activity to another kind of subsistence activity, be that in construction or various other things. So the first point about India's structural transformation is that it is very clearly an outlier when it comes to the size of the informal sector. And that, of course, brings up the question, why is that the case? Why is policy not able to take care of this? And we can hopefully discuss that. The second thing is that even though the share of the organized sector in employment has stagnated for many years, and if you compare the 2011-12 NSS survey to the PLFS survey, you find that the share of the organized sector in total employment has more or less been around 23 or 24% for many years, which is very disappointing, of course. However, if you look at the share of wage workers as opposed to casual and self-employed workers, that has actually been increasing in this same period. Right? So even though we are not scaling up production, productive activity as we would want to, nevertheless, the transition away from self-employment and casual labor to wage work is happening within the informal sphere. Right? So there is a restructuring happening both in the informal quote unquote sphere in the sense employment and sector together, but also within the informal sector. So if you look at the employment data and just look at the unorganized part, you find a decline in self-employment, a decline in casual wage work, and a rise in what is called in the NSSO language, regular wage work. Now, of course, regular wage work does not mean by any means organized sector protected employment. It just means you have a regular wage. Nevertheless, analytically, that point is significant because it is a transition away from a clearly subsistence kind of or a surplus labor, if you will, economy to something that resembles a capitalist economy. So we are now talking about that part of the unorganized sector, which is capitalist in nature, which mostly we have thought of as too small to really care about. Right? We have a stylized fact that most of the informal sector is self-employed, own account workers, unpaid family workers, casual workers. And many years that was true, but now, as of the most recent PLFS, for example, to just give you a number, 25% of workers in the unorganized sector are regular wage workers. Right? And that's a significant number, that's a quarter. And that has been rising in recent years. This is the emergence of the and Partha, I'm sure, will talk more about this. He has done work on this too, uh, uh, is the emergence of the capitalist part of the informal sector, to which we need to pay great attention. And that's how I'll complete my story. If we want to make this an effective participant in India's development story, and for all the reasons that you mentioned, Arash, which is that it is actually quintessentially Indian. Right? And I'll say a little bit about what I mean by that. Before that's the last thing I'll make. Before that, one point I want to make relatedly is the question of skills and productivity that you also raised. Right? So the moment we start thinking about the informal sector not as simply subsistence or fallback activity, which is something that people do to survive. Of course, that is a big part of it. But an increasing part of the informal sector is not that. It is people making profits. It's the capitalist economy. But we think of it as a low skill, low productivity economy nevertheless. And it is true that compared to higher scale enterprises, small scale informal sector enterprises do not have the same productivity, or indeed workers with any formal education. But that does not mean that they are unskilled. As you yourself pointed out, there are many years of skilling that go into many informal occupations. We just haven't developed the policy apparatus to recognize those things, and that is incumbent on us to do that. On productivity, again, the failure to take into account the existence of long value chains means that we misunderstand constantly what productivity actually is when the organized and the unorganized sector link up with each other through subcontracting relationships. Because most of the so-called value added is in the organized sector. That's where the high markups are, that's where the market power is. The informal sector or the unorganized sector is very close to the textbook case of a highly competitive market. The margins are very low, so entrepreneurs are bound to compete with each other and lower prices to the point where a simple price-based or a value-added based definition of productivity simply doesn't do justice to what they are doing. Most of the value is being realized elsewhere in the value chain. We have known all this for many years, but we keep making this sort of assumption, at least in the policy literature. Very quickly, in the last 2 minutes, I want to come to this idea of what is so Indian about the informal sector. As you said, a lot of informal activity owes its roots to artisanal and craft traditions that go back a long way. And that is true not just in textiles or handicrafts, things that will come readily to mind, but in many, many other sectors, services and manufacturing included. In fact, I'm prepared to go out on a limb and ask people here to think about whenever they buy a product or a service that to them seems Indian, to see if it really just goes back to the informal sector wherever they buy it from. Right? It doesn't matter if you buy it from Fab India or wherever else, where that product has been developed and has come from is from the informal sector. So whatever we have to contribute in terms of cultural and heritage rich goods and services, and I would say a way of living, that is the output of the informal sector. That's the knowledge output of the informal sector. And the policy challenge, Keshav, I'm sure will say a lot more about this, is how to make this a dynamic and prosperous economy. And that's a very different challenge from thinking of it as something in need of quote unquote formalization. Right? Formalization is a byproduct of what we would like to happen, which is for these enterprises to scale up, to have the room and the surplus to innovate and grow into new markets and new products, none of which they have right now. Right? And none of which sort of textbook formalization does for them. So my last point here would be that we are sitting on an absolute gold mine of really culturally rich economic practices all over, right? In food and beverages, in textiles, in furniture, in handicraft, whatever you want to talk about. Our challenge is how do we leverage that into becoming an economy that is actually an Indian economy, right? In the way that, let's say, the Mediterranean economies are Mediterranean economies. When we look at them, we know what's different about them. So that would be, I think, the main policy challenge in front of us as far as the informal sector goes. Thank you. Sorry, I took a little longer.
Thank you so much, Amit, for really laying out for us the conceptual distinctions between the different concepts that we are trying to grapple with over here in this webinar. And I'm sure in the discussion we'll have the chance to unpack some of the points that you raise, and also the threads that have emerged from your contribution. But without taking more time, I would like to now invite our second panelist, Dr. Paromita Sen, who is a research manager at Seva Bharat, to share her comments.
Hi, sorry, I couldn't figure out how to unmute myself. Yes, so I'm so glad to be here. This is a really great opportunity, and I'm so glad to be back. I think the last time we spoke, it was about gender and COVID. So this time, I'm still going to be the gender person, I guess. I'm going to be the gender person again in this space, but primarily because of the lessons that I can draw from, right? It's like all of you do such wonderful research and policy work, and then it's our job as an organization to try and see what that looks like in the ground and try to like take those lessons from the ground and again move them back up. So all my lessons and all of this, I'm just drawing from what the Seva movement has taught us and all the opportunities that we see here. So I'll do very little on the landscape because I think Professor Pasole did a much more comprehensive job. And then I'll talk a little bit about the opportunities and solutions that we are seeing in our work when we think about the future of employment for the informal economy. So just a little bit of a heads up, like a little bit of a catch up for everyone on who I represent. So Seva Bharat. So the Seva movement was started in 1972 by Ila Ben. We are a movement, we're a family of organizations now that work to further promote self-reliance and women's empowerment for women in the informal economy. As of right now, we represent 21 lakh women across 19 states. The organization that I represent, Seva Bharat, our job is to take this movement to new states and to new parts of India, help strengthen the movement. So again, as I mentioned, I'm just going to quickly skim through the landscape because I think at this point of time, we all know a little bit about the challenges of being in the informal economy, the kind of scale, the kind of business that we're talking about, how women especially are at the bottom end of this and how they occupy very little when it comes to like the kind of size and the scale of work that they're doing, some of the challenges that they're facing when they try to access credit. So just thinking this is very specifically just something we're doing with women micro entrepreneurs. And the kind of challenges that women face, it's just really hard for them to tap into the formal sector, right? So even when we're trying to make that transition from informal to formal, there are a series of challenges. However, in one of the things that we started to realize in our time, like working through all of this, is that when we talk about the informal economy, when we talk about women in the informal economy, as Professor Pasole has already mentioned, right, like it's a very, very wide variety, right? Like the industries, I mean, this is an economy we're talking about, but the industries are really vast, right? We're talking about goat rearers, but we're also talking about soap makers, we're talking about farmers, home-based workers, street vendors. You might be working with clothes, you might be working with BDs, right? Like it's a completely different skill set, a different part of the country, a different microeconomy you're tackling with. So just trying to understand, like, first of all, like disaggregating this, right? So when we're talking about reassessing the role of the informal sector, the informal economy, what part of it, like a one-stop solution isn't going to work in this space, right? So this conversation, I think, Professor Fazli had already mentioned in his introduction, like the need for more context-driven kind of conversations, right? So first of all, just disaggregating the informal sector. And so specifically, I'll just talk, for like a couple of examples that I want to give of some of our women, right? So talking here about Rekha Ben, right? So Rekha Ben works, she was a farmer, she was an agricultural worker and out of Bihar. And part of the problem was, no one's recognizing her work, right? So now as an agricultural worker, and one of the things that we've seen her do is she continues doing her agricultural work. But now, after attending residential training, she's now started working in goat rearing and in helping other women manage to look after their goats and create a more effective and a more enabling environment for women to get involved in agricultural activities and get involved in agricultural and allied activities primarily, right? and the scope of this. So again, it's not that she's given up agriculture. She continues to be an agricultural worker. She's just doing something other than agriculture. Similarly, over here, when we talk about Manju Ben, right? So Manju Ben runs a Kirana store, which, I mean, I think we've all seen the, Kirana stores all around our country. While the Kirana store is registered in the man's name, if it is registered, the entire family is involved with them, and the entire family is a family-run enterprise, and the kind of work that they are doing. Part of the challenges that she faces, right, as a micro-entrepreneur, is that for a woman, like when you have to run a business, you have to do multiple things. You have to do sourcing, you have to do run your finances, you have to manage accounting, you have to do marketing, you have to do branding, depending on the kind of product you do. And we're asking one person to do all of this, and that's a lot of challenges that these women face. They're trying to do this, right? But like, how do we support this woman in her process? And then just a final case study is when we're thinking about, again, the informal sector, we have to take into account the intergenerational challenges, right? That's some of the things that we are seeing. So just talking about Aisha, her entire family, like her mother and her grandmother, they've all been BD rollers. Everyone in her community are BD rollers out of Murshidabad. That is the dominant trait for women there, and that's the major opportunity. Aisha is also a BD roller, right? She's been rolling BD since the age of 7, so for over 10 years. However, thanks to the fact that the Indian political system has actually led to a lot of education for these girls, she is a 12th grade pass, right? So she's finished her schooling, and there just aren't the opportunities for her to figure out how to transition from a school into a trade. There's very little opportunity available in Murshidabad. So how do we help her around with that, right? So how is it that we manage that balance? In the space of trying to figure out what this means, right? So when we're thinking about all of these different case studies, some of the questions that arise for us is, are we trying to transition them out of the informal sector into the formal sector, or are we just trying to make their lives, make them have more agency and empowerment over their own employment trajectories, right? So for Aisha, she doesn't really have the opportunity, and maybe not, and her mother, Mother Manjura Khaitan, doesn't particularly want to leave the informal sector, right? BD rolling is a trade that we're all just like underpaid and all of that, and we absolutely agree. But for Manjura Ben, it doesn't make sense for her to switch to another trade. BD rolling allows her to balance her care work. She is responsible. She has 5 children, and her mother and her mother-in-law all living with her. The men have left Murshidabad because of out migration. BD rolling, the work comes to her doorstep. She's able to do it at her doorstep while handling her entire care work responsibilities. The roads there aren't great. The transport facilities aren't great. So she can't make it to a skilling center. This BD rolling, this informal sector employment that she's doing, allows her to balance her life, the life she has to lead, the ecosystem that she has to exist in, as well as handle all the other opportunities. So for something like, so in a context like that, right? So, and similarly for Aisha, she does want to continue education, but it's complicated in the space of Murshidabad. So one of the things that we've seen is like, what does it mean to reimagine making the informal sector itself a little bit more dignified, right? Like not so much about, so like, let's not take away BD rolling or like that kind of like home-based work, but make home-based work something that's a little bit safer, that's a little bit more, that looks after the rights of women and rights of workers just a little bit more, right? So a couple of solutions that we've been experimenting with and that we've been working with, but not just within Seva Bharat, but like with partners, is trying to figure out what are these different solutions in which we can, one, either transition informal women workers into the formal economy, or make the informal economy a little bit more, like bring in a little bit more dignity into the world of work, right? Because I think as we've discussed earlier before in the series itself, the informal economy might not be going away anytime soon, and we need solutions that help these next few generations that we don't lose them. So one of the big things that we've seen is worker-owned organizations are more resilient, worker cooperatives. So especially during the COVID pandemic, given that this is partially, right? So one of the things that we've seen, the worker cooperatives were able to support their workers a little bit better, right? So the example of Mondragon out of Spain, given that the impact that COVID had on businesses, they were able to really survive and pull through. So based on that, one of the things that we've been working on is try to figure out, as I mentioned earlier, right? So with the example of, I think Manju Ben, who's a micro entrepreneur, and she has to handle all those different aspects of the business. That's really complicated for anybody, right? Like I have all the privilege of all the privilege of education and stuff. I don't like looking at finance books. I'm not good at it. Asking a grassroots woman to do all the aspects of business is complicated. One of the things that we've seen is bring women together to run a business. Right? So that's one of the options that we've been really trying to figure out that space for, which is the space of collective enterprises, right? These are enterprises, but it reduces the barriers for women to enter the formal economy and to engage with the formal economy. Because while one woman might be very good at marketing, another woman is very good at governance, and another woman is very good at management, bring them together, and the kind of support that we need, right? The kind of federations and the kind of support services needed to enable these women. I think when people think of Seva, one of the best examples that people know about is Seva Bank. Seva Bank is a collective enterprise of women in the informal economy who got together and ran a bank. They were illiterate when they started this work. They learned how to sign their names, and they now run a very profitable bank, which is still entirely run by women in the informal economy. So it's absolutely possible. It just, one of the things that we realize is it takes a long time horizon, right? So when we're thinking about like, how do we do this and how do we like support the informal sector, one of the things is our time horizons have to look a little bit different. Other than this, the other services that we think about to support women-owned businesses is peer learning platforms, right? That's the one I want to stress here. Peer learning and then the innovations lab, innovations, the scope for innovation. But peer learning platforms, right? One of the things we realize in our time here is that we all have networks. I mean, a large part of this conversation that we're doing, we know each other, we work with each other, networks, and this opportunity to learn from each other. Like I'm learning so much just from this webinar, right? For women in the informal sector, just for the informal sector generally, the nature of the informal sector requires a lot of isolation. A large part of what defines the informal economy is that they aren't coming together, right? Domestic workers don't have a working space. They're not taking the same bus to work, right? So creating peer learning platforms for women, right? So creating an opportunity for women to learn from each other and to create that kind of like cross-national like solidarity and benefit from each other's experience is a really important thing. Additionally, bringing in the scope of innovation. When we think of innovation, we always think of the kind of innovation that maybe a LinkedIn or a Facebook does, right? But like innovation, I think as we mentioned, right, like the Indian economy, what is it? Like Jugaad. We talk about Jugaad so much. And I know there's a lot of academic work now that's going around Jugaad, which is really fascinating. But what is Jugaad? We're taking innovations and we're adapting it for the informal economy is adapting it for themselves, and then we figure out ways to scale it, right? But if we're going to do Jugaad and we're going to scale it, how do we make sure that the innovator, the actual person who came up with that invention, of the community, because these things are hardly individualistic, how do we ensure that the benefits of that comes down to them? This is just some of the examples that we've been doing. One of the things, so just because of the 3 case studies, right? So one of the things that we've seen with the young girl, right? These are the challenges that some of the women face, right? You're talking about women who have to manage education, who have to manage care work, but who also have to manage economic work, right? It's not possible for them, for instance, for all the time to do full-time jobs as we imagine, right? To do an 8 to 5 or a 9 to 5 as the formal sector might dictate. So trying to reimagine what gig work looks like for them, trying to reimagine that, which tackles their skill set. So one of the things that we've been doing is training young girls to become data collectors. And I'm using this example because this is an academic crowd, right? We all understand data, we all understand the need for research, but we also understand when it comes to that, you can train, like, getting girls in the community to help you train your questions. We've all done this, right? We've written out a questionnaire and then we go out, we have to pilot it with the community and figure out how to like phrase it in a very specific way so the community understands it. Getting that work done by community members, getting that work done by girls who've got an education is easy. Getting them to collect the data helps them go around colony, like in their communities. It's so much easier than me having to navigate rural Malda or like rural Choo in Jharkhand, right? I don't know that space, but the girl from there knows that space. I can transfer my skills to her. She does it. It's that specialization, it's that division of labor that becomes so much easier. She's playing to her strengths, I'm playing to my strengths. Additionally, something like that process, right? One of the things that we've noticed when it comes to skill development of women is that we might be able to train them in skills. We train them in, say, computer skills. Some of the things that we're missing out on is training them in the soft skills, right? Or teaching them to exploit their soft skills, right? So, for example, we think about the Salvation example, girls going around doing data collection. After that, we've seen these girls transition into sales and retail jobs. Because a large part of data collection requires you to go door to door and convince someone to give you data about their lives. Right, you're selling an idea, you're selling a research project, and trying to convince them. These girls have gone on to become very successful sales and retail agents. And then there are these spillover effects, right? So one of the examples, that's the reason I wanted to bring up this Baha'i example, is women in the mobility sector, right? Women, if you look at a construction site, women are the ones who are going to be carrying the heaviest head load and walking up and down. They're going to be paid the least amongst them. Mobility wise, women are unable to access jobs and unable to go far because transportation is really unsafe for them. So one of the pilots that we tried to do was get women to drive e-rickshaws, right? And because women were driving e-rickshaws, other women were able to send the children off to school with this. In those women run e-rickshaws, and they were able to therefore get a little bit more extra time when it comes to working hours. The challenge that these women face, the 7 women who started the e-rickshaws in one of the colonies, is that the people who give them the e-rickshaw batteries wouldn't give them space to where they can charge the batteries. The parking department and the license department made it very hard for them to get licenses. So these are the kind of systemic changes that we can try and advocate for, right? Because these are small things. All we're doing is say, let women have access to mobility. Let women talk about their homes and where they live, right? So these are just some of the small scale solutions and the context driven solutions that I think we've been playing around with. But again, going back to the larger question that we've been trying to tackle, therefore, is women in the informal economy, do they want to transition into the formal sector, first of all? And what are the challenges required to transitioning them? We've seen collective solidarity, digital inclusion being some of those key things, but trying to figure out how to scale these solutions is a challenge for us. And the other thing is to make the informal sector itself a little bit more dignified and a little bit more worker friendly and a little bit more conducive and amenable to for work and for dignified work in the future of employment. But yes, that's all I have to say about that. Yes. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Paromita. This was, I think, a very helpful illustration of some of the points that we were discussing in the initial comments, and also it, in a sense, your presentation helped illustrate what can be done by organizations working in the grassroots in terms of empowering, in terms of drawing upon the strengths and resources that exist in the informal sector. And especially, you helped us look at this question through the lens of women, which in a sense that brings a certain perspective, which is very helpful. So we have, I think, 2 questions. One is a question for Professor Amit. It says, how do informal workers come out of the subsistence economy when the quality of public education is so poor? So I think it's a helpful area to discuss about, which is what is while one recognizes the wealth of cultural resources, capacities that the informal sector has, the workers have, how is that mobility going to come about? And is it reskilling them? Which is it for organizations such as Seva Bharat to do it, or do you see scope for the state? Is our higher education, tertiary education system catering to that segment? So that's the whole area of, I mean, who is the education system really reaching out to? What kind of jobs is it creating? So maybe we could take that question and then look at the next.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, the 2 are sort of in the same domain, both the questions. And let me just take a very few minutes to, because it's huge and, we can't do justice to it. But the way I had put it in an article a few years ago was that we have people, who are skilled without being educated, and we have people who are educated without being skilled. We have both problems. So these are different problems and they need different solutions. My feeling is that if we think of education instrumentally as allowing a person to engage with the world to further their own aspirations and to grow their business, this sort of a view of education, so we are setting aside any kind of larger view of education, then the problem is a little bit more, I think, solvable, because we do know precisely what the education has to deliver so that people find it useful. And the question of whether vocational types of upskilling and so on will ever have the same amount of respect, as you said, Arash, in the beginning, as mental labor, right? Now that's a question that gets us into caste and gets us into some very, very long persisting sort of issues in India, which we don't have the time to discuss here. I personally believe that until these are related, we can't be denying caste and also hoping that this problem will go away. Caste has to be center stage in this question. However, there is still some room for policy, which links to the third question. In recognizing what exists, what kinds of skills and knowledge people have, and bringing it back to them to augment it on their own terms. Now, this part is very critical because our experience of things like the biodiversity and other kinds of knowledge portals is that a lot of it is just about digitizing what exists in traditional knowledge systems, right? And very little of it actually speaks to people's concerns of where the knowledge comes from. We certainly don't want another thing like that, where all you're doing is taking skills and we already have it, right? It's much more critical to think about how are we going to have this knowledge which is systematized more than it is now, so that it is more visible and has more respect, but nevertheless is developed on their terms and speaks to their today's concerns. Not easy to do. I would like to hear Keshav's views on this, because I think he has thought a lot more about it than me. So hopefully this question will come back then. But it's a good question. I don't think we should, though, give up on short-term solutions because we can't fix the education system quite yet, or we can't fix caste yet, right? These two are very, very large things, but there are many things to do without us solving those things.
Paromita, would you like to take either of these questions? There's another one, there's a fourth, which is what are some of the other avenues that Seva is exploring for transferring skills and exploiting existing soft skills? How have you been approaching this for uneducated? Just before you address the question, sorry, I just want to also link to what Amit was sharing. In a sense, there's this question of how one does not become instrumental in this question of providing skill, reskilling, or even if it's education. Because in a sense, when one says that this, like Amit was saying in his presentation, India is a culturally rich community, and economic activities of this sector reflects those values and those principles that people have in their community. Somehow the question is, how does one also ensure that the genius of these people, their what is, for example, the Seva Atiti, this idea of the value of hospitality, or the value of solidarity, which is inherent to their communities, to their sense of who they are. How does that somehow not get lost as a value in the process of being, how does one make sure it doesn't just get monetized in the process of saying, okay, now you come into the capitalist economy, like Amit was saying, but then in the process, maybe something of that value gets diminished. I don't know if this question is too philosophical, but anyway, I wanted to throw it out for all our speakers. But Paromita, please go ahead.
No, I actually don't think that. I mean, I think it is philosophical, but I think it's an important philosophical underpinning to this, right? It's one of these questions that we have, these larger questions around. So when we started this movement, Elaben, Renalaben, the thought leaders in this space, right? Their whole thing is just like, let's not demonize the informal sector. sector. Sometimes people make that choice and women make that choice, and that's okay. Like that's an absolutely a choice that you get, right? A lot of us nowadays, for instance, we've been having, I'll just use an example. We've been having a very hard time finding a graphic designer to join our team at Seva Bharat, because a lot of graphic designers are moving towards gig work. They don't want that full-time job. They want that flexibility, right? After COVID, so many of us young professionals want a job that allows us to go to the hills for 2 or 3 months, right? That's our privilege and all of that speaking. And this isn't the same thing as what a street vendor is facing when it comes to the informal sector, right? But when we think about the informal sector, when we think about like what it means to be in the informal sector, I think someone in the comments has also questioned, right? Informal sector is without access to that social security, without access to employment laws and all of that stuff, right? Strengthen that. We can strengthen that. But if you strengthen that social security net that the informal sector workers have, then a lot of what we demonize about the informal sector becomes a little bit easier, which allows us to then have that space, that scope to have these conversations around, well, what does education mean? What does skilling mean? We're talking here about the value of a public school education. I spent a few years in America and I left the American higher education system for a very simple reason. America's like beginning to realize that maybe there isn't that much value in that, right? A lot of people are moving towards going back towards blue collar jobs. They say, great, intellectualism is great and all of that stuff, but get a job. Don't take on the $80,000 loan that you have to do to go to college. Get a job, learn a skill, do a vocational thing, get a job. That's what the informal economy is doing, right? For some of these girls, they're getting jobs right after school. We're having a very hard time balancing telling a girl, please finish your college and then move into like some of these jobs that we're training you and skilling you for, right? So it's a mindset shift and all of that stuff, right? Like in thinking that the informal sector versus the formal sector, one isn't bad, one isn't good, right? Like what is it about each that characterize these, and what is the cultural baggage that we are bringing to this conversation? And within this baggage, so that's a larger conversation, a much larger debate. So Seva has some of these debates, but for Seva, it's a very simple thing that you keep having that debate, fix the basic thing, right? Like to be able to have that debate and to have women participate in that debate, if a woman can make sure that she doesn't have to worry about rent, that she doesn't have to worry about health insurance, that she knows there's food coming on the table, she's able to then make that decision of does she want to become an entrepreneur, does she want to register her business, does she want to engage with that economy in a certain way or not, right? Like that choice comes in if you make sure, like a Maslowian hierarchy, right? You make sure her food and her shelter and her safety are taken care of, then the choice to do things above that comes into place. And it is very, very possible that she might not make those choices that we think she'll be making. I'm talking about it in a women's sense because that's just my default, but this is just generally, right? Like it's not a woman or a man thing. These choices, we can only make a choice if our basic needs are being met, right? Otherwise, that's not a choice. We don't have that's a luxury, right? A choice is a luxury, right? So figuring out how to do that and then having those conversations. I've never been in the informal sector. I've always been in the formal sector. I've had that, but I think of that as a privilege, right? But one of my friends is an entrepreneur. She's going off and doing her own thing, and she doesn't know sometimes that she has a lot of money, sometimes she doesn't have a lot of money, right? She doesn't have an employer who provide her rights. When she goes in and negotiates with contractors, it doesn't work out that well for her. That's a choice that she's made though. And I made a choice. I am not an entrepreneur. I will never be one. These are choices that we get to make. What does that look like for the informal sector? And a large part of that comes down to questions around, you give them that base, you give them that education, the choice, that agency to make that, and then figuring out where we see this division coming in, right? And not thinking of it again, just going back, bad, good. It's not as simple as that. As I think what we're trying to think of. So philosophical, yes, but I think that's a really important philosophical underpinning.
I'd like to also invite our other two panelists, Keshav and Partha. Would you like to comment on any of these? Please go ahead.
Partha, you will say something?
I will finish my main course, then I will come.
Okay. Actually, some of these issues I may be sort of very briefly touching upon in the presentation that I'm planning now. And I think as both Amit and Paramita mentioned, so I think there's a huge question about like what kind of education, what kind of skill, even if you are sort of like, let's say, creating opportunities for skill, how relevant is that? So in fact, there is this whole discourse about a large number of training programs, whether done by the state or non-state actors for skill formation. How useful has that been? I mean, so it is not enough that you sort of you hold a training program and create or sort of like give ideas about a certain skill, and then later. So I did not find a job sort of which is linked to that. I mean, there has been several critiques of the standard skill programs that you're talking about, and that really varies. Like, for instance, certain kinds of mindset, those who are sort of the agencies who are sort of proposing the skills, for instance, like, I mean, sort of the state might think that giving driving skill is a great thing to do, but maybe the person is looking forward to learning some skills in the computers. So what I'm saying is, so in the absence of understanding or sort of mapping what kind of demands are there, what kinds of aspirations are available, so just talking about creating skills and sort of that becomes a half-life skill, in fact. So that really doesn't take you very far. I think the entire sort of like process of the skilling, the obsession with training, and we think we have done a great service. And in that process, as Amit did mention even earlier, like some of those who are actually capable of skilling, whether they are craftspersons or whoever they are, they may not have the formal degrees or they may not be formally affiliated to an institution, but might still be the most relevant skill givers. So I think unless we have a mapping of what kinds of skills are required, how sort of like redundant the existing skill system is, unless you sort of like propose a critique of that, I don't think only discussing in terms of creating some skills for some people for some time and then not being able to link it to any sort of, let's say, gainful employment for which it was originally meant. In fact, this whole ICT infrastructure, if you see, I mean, if you see the whole AICT, for instance, the All India, the Technical Education Council, for instance, so a large number of IT and ITES related skills and trainings and curriculum, if you like, they have become redundant. In fact, many of these institutions, many of the courses are closed down because suddenly you are sort of faced with what you may describe as disruptive technologies, for which even the teachers are not qualified to teach the students. So how dynamic we are, how responsive we are to the changing demand for skill, the new kind of technology we are facing, and what we have done in terms of preserving also like innovative ways of imparting even traditional conventional skills, let's say, as many of the East Asian countries, particularly South Korea, has done, sort of bringing in, let's say, this whole creative sort of sector is linked through the ICT and sort of promoting local crafts and local sort of knowledge, and so it has been a gainful connection they have made. So for us, I think we have probably not really thought through the specificities of skills, and we are more interested in the numbers of training programs we have done and a number of students we may have given certificates, but I think that's sort of falling far too short of what the changes are demanding, in fact. Thank you.
Can I add one observation?
Yes, please.
Okay. So what Professor Das was saying, in addition to that, this training and capacity development, most of the training are delivered in a multiple dose method rather than in a combo. So that's why there are so many institutes providing similar kind of training module or capacity development program, but in a scattered way. If you want to train an entrepreneur, you have to give all those in a combo package rather than in a multiple dose. And in India, we have seen this phenomenon of
I think we lost him.
Partha, can you hear? I think might be a problem with the connection. Anyway, I think we'll come back to him, and hopefully as we move ahead, he can, share his comments. But this has been very helpful. I think this comments that have been shared and the questions have helped us think more deeply on some of the themes that have arisen. One question that I still have, which maybe I'll raise again in the latter part of the discussion, is, this question of also, again, this may be a little philosophical, but then there's this question of the fragmentation of work from the other aspects of, the community, the individual's lives, which somehow, for example, in Paromita's presentation, one could see how there's an attempt to keep that connection between the social, the economic, that which pertains to the community, even the spiritual. And I would think the same would be true for weavers, for many of these artisans for whom their vocation is not just a means to earn an income. It's part of who they are, their place in the world. And then there's just this question of how does, when Amit was referring to this flourishing, and in a sense, how does that kind of economy really, this rich expression of cultural life that one sees, there's the question of how does one protect that, and in a sense have a process of change that does not increase fragmentation and alienation, and then one that ends up with an exoticization of all that they had, which was really meaningful, or a monetization of it. Anyway, we can discuss these questions more later, but for now, we move on to our next speaker, Professor Keshav Das. Is a professor of economics at the Gujarat Institute of Development Research. Please, over to you, Keshav.
Is my PPT seen?
Yes.
You can make it slideshow, Keshav.
Yeah. Thank you so very much, RS, and I'm particularly very happy and privileged that I have panelists like Amit, I have panelists like Paromita and like Partha. So I'm very, very happy to be with them because they are also the people who have done a lot of work, so much to learn from them. So I'm personally grateful to the organizers to bring us together. But then, having said that, we also know that we are dealing with a subject which is too vast, and maybe we have not quite figured out all the dimensions of this particular sector, or what the ILO would like to describe as the informal economy. But then let's sort of let's understand that maybe in the last, let's say, 3 or 4 decades or so, with so much of work being done on understanding the informal sector, I think the term informal sector has probably lost much of its ignominy, and whether these are attributed or real. But I think so. Just because you are part of the informal sector doesn't make you a lesser being, or doesn't make you work in a lesser sector. So I think the recognition that this informal sector, in terms of like creating jobs, in terms of being sort of local income, and also being sort of able to major instrument through which many of the poverty-stricken economies, including India, so we have maybe both the state and the non-state actors have sort of found a space through working in informal sector or engaging in informal sector, which sort of suggests that maybe we need to rethink more in terms of how to enable the sector and those who are working within it to have a better life. But then two small points, let me make it in the beginning. So one is like this whole informality that we are talking about actually related in the spheres of work and also in production itself, in the production process and in the infrastructure matters, like as Amit has already mentioned, like you may have been working in an organized enterprise, for instance, or a registered enterprise, if you like. But then if you are a contract worker there, so you are actually an informal worker or a temporary worker within an organized sort of setup. So that means in terms of the labor process, I may be informal, but in terms of the space of production, it may be unorganized or a formal space. So I would not think much about that, but then we have to really sort of, I'll be sort of focusing on one specific sort of sector, which is sort of broadly I call it the craft sector, which includes both the handlooms and the handicrafts, rural and urban areas mostly. Because I am referring to this because only after agriculture, this is probably the second largest employer of the informal workers, and much of the informal work, in fact, whether you sort of describe them as part of the OAMEs, the own account manufacturing enterprises, as in the NSS unorganized surveys, or like in terms of the work processes, the home-based work, if you like. So much of that probably happens here. And then, as you know, that so this sector also has sort of come up, has assumed a lot of prominence at a time when the farm sector, the agriculture, as Amit did mention, that has not been able to sort of throw out people from that sector, and sort of maybe they could not be absorbed in, let's say, the high-paying and organized sector jobs. And there are sort of larger issues which sort of like precede the discussion on formality informal, that we have actually neglected certain spaces, whether in terms of infrastructure, whether in terms of sort of linking these sort of activities to certain kinds of markets, whether sort of education, as we just discussed. So there are several major physically. So we have neglected some of the sectors, some of the space, and some of the, certain kinds of activities. And I think that has led to that when you have a fairly sort of like laudable of whatever, or a heritage that of all kinds of traditional activities which could have created employment, many of them are either dead or they are so languishing. And with that, so we also understand that there has been sort of the farm sector, the employment has come down. The non-farm sector has been the only sort of major source of employment. But then we also know that many of these worker categories are either the self-employed or casual workers. That means you are talking about a sector in which the employment possibilities are very high, but then the quality of employment is extremely problematic. So I shall come very quickly because I have a small presentation. So I'll be talking about certain sort of issues which leads to what I call as a forms of exclusion in an activity like the craft or the artisan-based or traditional sector, whichever we discuss. Very, very quickly, sort of 5S, and that's how I sort of have understood. Like there are certain kinds of activities which are actually sort of disadvantaged because the way they are, or the space in which they are located, whether in terms of infrastructure, whether in terms of sort of natural endowments, distances, etc., etc. So there have been certain activities, certain enterprises who are disadvantaged by the space and by the sector in the sense that what kind of the products which are coming, maybe they are no longer in demand, or certain based on certain raw materials which are no longer available, or there is very little scope for innovation, for instance. So you are sort of like confined or sort of dealing with a certain kinds of a subsector or a production in which it's very unlikely that you make a good business. Then there are sort of other sort of three issues that I have sort of flagged here. Some of them could be seasonal in nature, and some of these because of certain kinds of institutional sort of barriers coming, particularly if you are not a registered unit, maybe a lot of state support would not be forthcoming. And the last one, which I call as a statistical exclusion, I think to me that seems that any discussion on the informal sector, I think sort of it really tells us that we have very, very poor statistics on this, and particularly on the craft sector, on which I'm sort of focusing. There has been a kind of a general neglect since the second 5-year plan, and particularly the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956 onwards, when we sort of focused on sort of large enterprises, and we sort of focused on maybe the SMEs, the small and medium enterprises, which would be largely sort of working as subcontractors to large enterprises. And there was very little that we did, though we did mention about the craft sector, the rural industries. You talked about the artisan-based sort of enterprises, but then very little sort of support, particularly support coming from the financial sector, the banking sector, for instance. So these were very seriously sort of neglected. And then one quick point is, like, if you see, when you're talking about this sector, and I'll be giving you some further data in the next slide. So what kind of information we have? We have a handicraft, of which, I mean, we are taking so much of pride in a sector like this, a rich culture, heritage, etc., etc. And in the last 75 years, we have done the handicraft census only once. That was in 1995. So we know nothing about the number of enterprises. We know nothing about what kind of subsectors people are working. We know nothing about the technology. We know nothing about the markets. And we are here to discuss about a sector which might be might be providing the second largest sort of number of jobs in the country. And even if you take sort of like information, I mean, that I've put together information from the Craft Council of India, the NSSO data, and also the Development Commission of Handicraft data. So the information, even in terms of the total number of units in a given year, so they vary so very much from, let's say, 9,000 to say something like that is the kind of a variation that we are seeing. And there are several sort of activities, several crafts which are not actually included in the census or in this sort of estimates, because all that which comes, because this comes under the Ministry of Textiles, and so many of the handicrafts are not part of this, including gems and jewelry, which actually is one of the highest export earners for India for a long time. And this is the kind of a, so I very much want to show you this one. This was sort of compiled by Ashok Chatterjee, of the former president of the Craft Council of India, and the kind of the database, like we sort of, if you see those figures in red in millions, sort of some estimate that it could be as high as 250 million workers maybe are there in this sector. As RS was telling me, if it is about 400 million, if that is the size of the employment in the informal sector, so it's more than half probably sort of accounted for by this. And we have nothing, no information, even in the economic census. There is no information about the crafts, excepting for the 2013-14 economic census, in which for first time we did introduce some questions about the number of artisans. And within this, what I also want to emphasize is that artisans who are women, the female artisans, about which we have very, very extremely poor information, and we know nothing about that. And when you're talking about skilling, when you're talking of training, so when we do not know about what kind of enterprises we have, we do not know how many people are engaged, we do not know about the infrastructure, we do not know about the technology. So what is the discussion that we are doing in terms of like sort of scaling up and sort of providing training? So I don't think training per se is going to help very much. I'll sort of very quickly take you through two sort of my field-based sort of clusters of crafts, just to give you a sense of what I am sort of trying to hint at. This is a small cluster of terracotta products in Rajasthan, in a village called Molela. This cluster or this product has got the GI certification, geographical indication certificate, very old, etc., etc. But then, so what happens? Like the whole village for last 400 years, they are engaged in a product like this. This is the classic informal sector activity at the rural level, based on local knowledge, local skill, and local resources. And but then this is a brittle product. We have made no plans for packaging. We know nothing else about how to market this. We know nothing about product diversification. And the only sort of minimal change that we could make in terms of, if you call it a kind of a product or process innovation. So maybe you have made very, very marginal innovations, particularly, let's say, maybe we have used an electric fan to sort of dry the material, and there is very little that we have done in terms of promoting this craft, promoting its, enhancing its productivity and enhancing its reach to the market. And this is the kind of sort of like the maximum innovation you can find. Maybe sort of like you have a little paint on. There's an MBA student, is son of an that maybe some of these traditional products you could probably paint. So what I'm trying to, and then this is the GI certification which this cluster has got, and even if you say that the state has been very directly involved in promoting this craft, so we picked up these booklets from the ukaras or from the dustbins of the villages, because the villagers, after being trained in GI and after sort of this product was registered under the GI, you find that the local artisans have no understanding as to how to move forward with the GI certification. So this GI certification and whatever the documents that they had received in a training program were picked up by us, the survey team, from the dustbins of the craft village. And so this is how, so these are sort of sold on the roadside. And then I sort of quickly bring a small point to this, that apart from all those challenges of marketing, innovation, etc., and finance, of course, because these are all informal units, the whole basic raw material, which was available free in the location, now this is all sort of taken over by the local real estate companies. And so this basic raw material, the soil or the clay, that is no longer available to that. So what is our strategy if you're thinking of like bringing back or reinvigorating the informal sector in a rural setting where enterprises had been there, but then the private real estate mafia have taken over the local resources. So I go quickly to a second one. I often do field work, so I thought I'll show you something. And this is another place called Athani in Belgaum. So this is actually a kind of, again, a very old sort of craft-based sort of cluster of villages. So working on what we may generally describe as Kolhapuri chapels. And then the central government has actually Central Leather Research Institute, which is sort of based here. And a lot of I mean, you may say that a lot of formal support has come for the otherwise informal activity, but then this CLRI office or CLRI the training setup, which has been there for more than 30 years in this place, close to 40 years now, focuses only on making boots, whereas this place has always been sort of focusing on the Kolhapuri chapel. So that means, even if you have a formal training setup of the central government in the local place, for 40 years, they have not recognized that the local artisans are not manufacturing boots, they are manufacturing Kolhapuri chapels, and where this training center has been completely irrelevant to the local sort of processes. And this is where, again, a kind of a local NGO who sort of comes in ascent. Madhura Chhatrapati, maybe some of you know, she was very well-known women entrepreneur of India. So she introduces sort of more than 600 designs in the same Kolhapuri chapel, sort of using the same local people, same local resources, same skills, of course, with some additional soft skills of like managing finance, for instance. They are now exporting to more than 40 countries from this little place, where the state government offices, so they have not even recognized that what kind of product they are making. So what I'm trying to suggest is, if you are talking about an India in which sort of you really have a vibrant, sort of like a traditional sector-based activity in which employment can be created, which can be linked to the global market, I think we better think again that, and we sort of like go by what kind of constraints that we are facing. And sort of like very quickly in Japan, in Thailand, for instance, so they have done for this very similar kind of sectors, similar kind of regions, So they have gone in for very different kinds of interventions, whether in terms of like institutional innovations, whether in terms of support by the state, the non-state actors. As I often sort of mention the example of the Thai Airways, for instance, the Thai Embassy, for instance, in case of the OTOP, that is the one Tambon, one product idea. The other one is one village, one product, that the Japanese idea to begin with in 1960s. So you have sort of interventions which includes incentives for the artisans and sort of the data collection by the local students and a lot of sort of support given by the state to promote the product. And so that is how they have, in fact, so I tried out a kind of an interactive database for clusters, which is very, very different from those who are too used to the NSS, unorganized sector manufacturing data source all the time. They may not find it very interesting, but then this is the social statistics that you really have to generate when you're talking. So you have a sense of so the database must give you a sense of the sector or the subsector, must give you a sense of the space where it is located, what kind of support system is there. So all that, and accordingly, probably you can make sort of like intervention. This was one of the small suggestions I had made. But then, so to more or less to end my little presentation. So when you're talking about certain sectors or certain activities, you are thinking about promoting that. So maybe you have to think about at least three sort of specific issues. One related to the raw material, the second relates to the market, and third relates to the institutions. What kind of changes you could sort of bring in and where exactly to intervene. And unless you do that, unless you do a rethink on a kind of a sort of activity basis, no amount of general discussion about skilling, so talking in terms of certain kinds of providing certain kinds of financial sort of support through certain banks, I think those are not really going to enhance the business. In fact, unless all the business, small, big, craft, non-craft, rural, urban, wherever, unless they're linked to the relevant market, and in which if the state has not really played a significant and a substantive role, then we still will be celebrating the crafts and may still continue to have what I describe as the subsistence industrialization, where poor people in the informal domain will be suffering, and maybe slowly many of them would be moving out of it from one distress condition to another distress condition. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Keshav. This was really an in-depth. It gave us real insight into one segment of the informal sector and the issues involved and the challenges, as well as the possible areas where intervention is required. Thank you for sharing all of this with us. Before we take questions, maybe we can listen to our next panelist as well. Professor Partha Patim Sahu is an associate professor at the National Institute of Rural Development and Panchayati Raj. I would request him to please make his comments.
Yeah, thank you. Is it okay if I switch off the video?
I think
the network is little weak.
Yes, that's fine. But Professor Keshav, I think you will have to stop your slide presentation. Let me see if I can do it from here. Okay, that's great. Sure. Yeah, you can turn your video off if
okay. So when we will have Q&A, I will come back.
Sure.
Okay, thank you again. And I would like to spend some time on this question that Dr. Amit towards the end left. What are the policy challenges for this movement from informal to formal, or the whole lot of the question of formalization? So the bigger question before us is that how come we have such an elaborate formal institutional setup and we still find such a huge size of informal sector or informal sector workers? And a large number of enterprises operating outside the ambit of these formal institutions. And of late, we have seen there are series of interventions, policies, schemes in an attempt to make these informal enterprises and workers to move them to the formal setup, like all you will say demonetization, GST, different kind of portals for workers to get registered, different kind of portals for to provide support on a single platform for MSME. Different kind of portals are there, dashboards are being created. So a new form of development discourse is emerging, which you can call it as platformization, but I call it 4D, dashboard driven development discourse. So think of anything, there is a dashboard for it, but mere registration or mere getting a login password in some dashboard will help us, that worker or an enterprise, to get the benefit so that he or she will move to a formal setup. That is the big question. And whether this whole formalization initiative that central government and also the state government have come up, is it based on a deep thinking and vision? Is this formalization efforts are inclusive or sustainable? I think these questions are very much relevant, and at this particular time when we are talking about all this vocal for local, prioritizing the local economy, prioritizing the local entrepreneur, etc., etc. So for me, I think the bigger question or bigger challenge before us, how to create regular and sustainable income, not only for an enterprise, also for workers. So don't see one single enterprise as an enterprise. There is a family behind that enterprise, or there is a family behind that worker. So that we have to see. And for a worker sitting in a labor adda, doesn't matter whether he or she is in informal setup or formal setup. For him or her, the bigger question is whether he or she will be picked up that particular day or not. So the whole debate or discourse that we are talking about, whether to go to a formal setup or not, what kind of advantages this informal enterprises and worker will get moving to a formal setup, all these are, in fact, I would say it will evolve. And after 75 years, we still have such a huge informal segment in our economy. And so we will continue to have such a big informal sector or informal segment in the economy. And what all has happened during this pandemic, we know the new kind of challenges have emerged for these informal enterprises as well as for workers. And all those stylized challenges are still there, but new, I would say, for example, with same ways they may be working more number of workers, or they may be getting less salary for working same 8-hour workers. Then workers burnout is a huge thing that may have come up. And besides that, one of the important challenge that I would say we should engage more on the learning loss or the skill loss. 2-3 years, if a worker or an entrepreneur is not doing anything, the kind of skill or the knowledge that he has, that might have also declined or subdued. Besides that, another important aspect is the psychosocial problem, the mental stress, the anxiety, low aspiration, not only for the informal enterprise owner, but also for the worker. So all these have in fact added to the long list of challenges that informal sector enterprises and informal workers witness. But in spite of that, we have one positive thing that has come up. I would say that we also face challenges, but during these challenges, these enterprises, these workers learn or adopt many coping strategy and all that. The one question that I would like to spend some time is that what are the possible pathways that we can think of in a rural context, of course, to transcend these informal enterprises and worker to a formal setup. So we have a large network of formal institutions, be it marketing, finance, incubation, etc., for not only for workers but also for enterprises. But how come still people are not aware of these institutions? Forget about the schemes and programs which these institutions are offering, which are meant for them. So one is to sensitize, aggressively sensitize people. Or it's sad and unfortunate that even now we are talking about that people are not aware of, but still that problem is still with us. So how to sensitize people? In addition to that, how to capacitate these people so that they will feel empowered and they will come forward to take the advantage of this formal institution. That is very important. And towards that, as Dr. Das was referring, the kind of training and capacity development programs which are run, operated by the large number of national and state regional institutes, most of them are supply driven. And he's correctly said that we are running after number. So the training need assessment is very important. Then, as I was telling, the delivery of training now happens in the scattered multiple dose phenomenon rather than in a combo. And from the other side, there is a lot to do to simplify these procedures also. So even now, if you go to a bank and to get a bank loan, you may have to fill up 10 or more 10 pages or 15 pages document. So like that, we have to work on both the sides. And there are schemes and programs during this pandemic time. For example, this especially for the food processing industries, we have a program called Prime Minister Formalization of Micro Food Processing Enterprises Scheme. Prime Minister Formalization of Micro Food Processing Enterprise Scheme, where there is a lot of, they are talking about capacity development, increase access to finance, incubation, etc., etc. Another important aspect in this formalization debate, which is completely missing in our informal discussion, is regular and continuous mentoring and handholding and counseling for these informal workers. There are agencies like banks, or there are agencies like rural self-employment training institutes, and there is a committee report by Reserve Bank of India which recommended that all the commercial bank branches, they are also supposed to provide mentoring and handholding to this MSME owner or enterprises. And in one of the report, Dr. Amit and others, they have said this creation of this Udyog Sahayak Enterprise Network, which if this is operated, implemented, we will see very big changes. In addition to that, what I see there is some potential is the community-led institutions like community resource person, like Seva, Pradhan, Kutumbasri, all of these organizations, they are closely working on this model. And this community resource person is a woman or a man, let's say, from that community. And this CRP, community resource person, is a person who is trained, has been given all those training which is needed. And this CRP is now will identify or provide all kind of support to aspiring and existing entrepreneur. We have Pradhan and Seva, both of them are working on this model, and I see there is a lot of potential in this CRP-led model to help informal enterprises and workers, help them to move to a formal setup, help them to operate sustainably, earn regular income. And as I was telling, this problem of psychosocial issues, mental stress, anxiety. So this CRP, this community resource person trained CRP, not only provide business related skill and training, in fact, they can also provide psychosocial support to this informal entrepreneur, women and men entrepreneur, to build their self-confidence, capacity to decision making, and to stay in the power in handling social and economic pressures of the family and all that. There are a lot of good models, good work that CLBC, Community Livestock Business Center, all these are based on. For the other example that I can give you, it's one agency called Hagdarsak. They have created a community cadre of Hagdarsak entrepreneur, and they have been given training, and all these Hagdarsak entrepreneur, they carry a smartphone with internet connection, and they are going door to door to all BPL families and helping those BPL family to get to access different kind of schemes and programs of central government and state government. So the whole question of that people are not aware of, people are not able to access. So we have to think in that direction, how more and more people will get those information, more and more people will be capacitated to access those schemes and programs or be part of that formal setup to grow, to scale up, to graduate their enterprise or to improve their livelihood so far as these informal workers are concerned. The last point that I will highlight and I will close, and we can discuss more on this in the role of local institutions like Panchayat. Can we think that the Panchayat can be capacitated, their capacities can be improved so that this Panchayat can help identifying these aspiring and existing informal entrepreneurs, informal workers in their locality, and help them to connect with different type of schemes and programs which are available, which are meant for them. And many of you must be aware about this Gram Panchayat development plan. Anything now you do carry out in a rural setup, it has to pass through the GPDP. So can we mainstream all these issues related to informal enterprises, informal workers in this Gram Panchayat development plan? Can we schedule, can we conduct special Gram Sabha where these kind of issues are flagged up? And so that unless we need the pain points of these informal workers and informal entrepreneurs, we will not be able to give that what kind of help, support they need. So there are, of course, Panchayat alone cannot do this big challenge. They have to collaborate or they have to work in coordination with other stakeholders. There are a large number of other stakeholders who are now operating, they are present in the rural landscape. So if all these stakeholders work unitedly, like State Rural Livelihood Mission, NGOs, or like that, they work, then we can think of that this Panchayat can also work as a solution exchange platform or can play a role of support desk. And we have seen during this pandemic time how local institution play a very critical role. They were not only running quarantine center, but also providing medicine, food door to door. And in Odisha, in the Panchayat were given the power of district magistrate. So if that kind of trust we can repose on this local institutions, so in this formalization debate also, I see there is a role, critical role for this local institutions and this community-led institutions or agents. But in spite of that, I would say that we have a long way to go so far as the this formalization debate discourse is there. Even we have seen how lot of another point I would like to add, this lot of IT enabled portals are being created and lot of digital training are being given, and the panelist from Seva will be aware of that, the whole Lilavati project where they are working with women and imparting training on how to use social media, how to use WhatsApp, how to do digital marketing. But still, I would say the penetration of internet, the use of smartphone, all these are very low in that rural area, especially rural area and villages. And the quality of internet network is also an issue. Although in BharatNet, this government of India is trying a lot, but we still have to go a long way in terms of this digitization, platformization, etc., etc. So at the end, I will say that the formalization debate or discourse has to be seen from the perspective of the informal worker, from the perspective of the informal enterprises, and the kind of policy schemes those were implemented, those were formulated, whether it is matching with the need and requirement of those informal enterprises, informal workers, it is also a big question. So let me stop here, and if there is any question or comments, I will be happy to respond. Back to.
Thank you so much, Partha. This was really, again, a very, very enlightening your comments were very enlightening, especially on the rural context. And I just wanted to take up the last point that you mentioned, which was that digitalization and the use of platformization should be seen from the perspective of the informal workers. And there is a question in the, I think it's the last question, where it says, the couple of questions on technology. When technology is introduced to empower informal sector workers, it brings efficiency but creates other disruptions or distortions. How can we draw upon digital technologies without these disruptions? So I think, like, there is that question, but I'm also thinking, going back to Keshav's point about innovation, that there's such little innovation that happens. So one question is, technologies are created by those who create them, embed those technologies with certain values which belong to the society or the culture or civilization from which they come. So maybe a lot of these technologies may facilitate certain values, but not others. So the question is, it goes back to the question of local institutions, empowering communities. How can these processes somehow build capacity in communities to, and in the context of the work of informal workers, both to use technology in ways that avoid these traps which might be there, or alternatively find solutions which are indigenous, or find solutions with, like, why is digitization now the only thing when we talk about innovation? Are there not, like Partha was saying, what if the panchayat were a solution exchange that actually brings out innovations that are happening among communities? So I don't know if you would like to share thoughts on this, the panel.
I just want to make a small point here, because I think what Partha was referring to also about this. See, innovation is not necessarily always S&T level, science and technology innovation. Actually, it is the institutional innovation which is making a lot of difference. And I very, very quickly refer to some effort by, let's say, an organization called Industry. So like INDUSTREE. In fact, essentially, it's a kind of a non-farm producer organization. It's a kind of a sort of collectivizing efforts and sort of like whatever products from the artisan communities, and sort of linking them to a certain market, and with a lot of transparency in the contracts. So the contracts with the producers, the small producers, are done in a transparent manner, and then there is a kind of an assured market, and they're linked. And when you're talking about like other technological changes, like suppose, for instance, take the example of the Gems and Jewelry Export Promotion Council, for instance, about which we talk very little. In fact, one of the major sort of like export earners for India, and it's almost entirely home-based. and in many of them small towns and in rural areas. So they are using the internet in a manner, in fact, the state which has played a significant role in sort of running this platform, this internet platform, in which so they are linking the buyer to the producer, and also in terms of varieties of sort of like design suggestions, for instance. So all that sort of networking has been possible through the internet as well. But then there are other kinds of intervention, like suppose you go to Tripura, for instance, where it's, you have a bamboo based activities are there. So what you need, if you're talking about productivity, well, there is not a question of the raw material shortage. Actually, it's a question of how best you can sort of market your produce, how you can sort of enhance the productivity. So you introduce a kind of a small machine which sort of cuts slivers. Maybe that machine costs you 4,000 rupees. So with that, the production of the basic processed material sort of increases, and maybe you can go for better products. But at the same time, the question about institutional innovation is that whether there is a bank which is providing, let's say, low-cost loan to the local artisan to access that 4,000 rupees by which that person can buy the machine. So long as we are delinking the production process from a variety of, let's say, services, business development services, if I may say so, not just the finance, not the working capital loan, which we celebrate always through the mudra or whatever, but there are several like business-centric infrastructure. In fact, there is a question about local economy, and what about providing electricity to enterprises? Have we thought about this? Have we thought about this in the context of the rural sector, for instance? So all these do matter, and I think so the innovations are not only in the sphere of digitalization or not only in the sphere of science and technology, a lot of institutional innovation might have. Thank you. Sorry, I took a lot of time.
Thank you, Keshav. There's this question which you briefly alluded to. I don't know if any you or other panelists would like to comment on. To support artisans, shouldn't we focus on strengthening their local economy? I don't know if anyone would like to comment or.
Maybe Amit would say something. Yeah.
Well, you know, I think we should be strengthening local economies anyway. That's not something that you know is particularly an artisan issue. Local economies have a lot of different kinds of actors, and we have really not leveraged you know, either their skills and their capacities, nor have we really been serious about their welfare and so forth. With artisans, it becomes very striking because they get you know, due to lack of bargaining power, etc., and lack of policy support, they are in these long value chains where you know, there's a huge disparity, as said earlier, between what's the final realized price of the commodity and what the artisan gets. So that really becomes very striking. However, I think you know, the reason I'm resisting making it all local is because we also know that there is a lot, it's precisely in these kinds of goods and goods, to a large extent, some extent services, that a lot of export potential and large market potential lies. So it can't be all local. Right? So the question is, how do we create the institutions where a large part of the gains of reaching new markets reaches producers themselves? And the GI was part of that, obviously, but we haven't done enough of it. But you know, we have hundreds of GIs. By now we have some 800 or so GIs, I think. So clearly there's a lot of potential in all of this stuff, but we haven't been serious about it. So yes, local, yes, but it can't be limited to that.
There is a question, I think two questions which are related. I think it's to Professor Das. Any comments regarding GST in handloom sector, which is making it more and more difficult to handloom weavers and handloom sellers? Then there's another one, which is, does access to financial technology and moving away from cash-based economy through moments like demonetization benefit the informal sector and informal workers? That seems to be the only coverage that combines both the formal and informal sector. So I don't know if you would like to comment on this.
Actually, this has been very much discussed in the media, particularly the GST on the handlooms. And from the first thing is, it was initially not there. Then they introduced a 5%. Then by the January 2022, I think this was proposed, or this was increased to 12%. So I think, and where you have something like more than 80% of the weavers actually sort of, they depend on this. And I think one major argument which came from the handloom sector, that was more very badly hit by the pandemic. And on top of that, you are sort of increasing the GST from 5 to 12%. So was a big blow. In fact, but then the state sort of explained it the other way around, saying that this being a very vibrant sector, maybe this should actually, the GST income from this would sort of like whatever fill or whatever may supplement the revenue of the state. So it was a kind of a, so this has been, so but personally, if you ask me, I think maybe one could have waited till the sector sort of like jumped back to action, and one could have waited had they made good sort of business in the coming years. I think that probably was not a very prudent decision to enhance the GST. So that was one point. The other thing is about the technology side. I think I mean, there is a very sort of like, I mean, there's several, in fact, interesting studies on the fintech sort of scholars who have been saying it has to depend on the relevance. So it is not just because you have a technology there, so it has to be used. If certain, like there are sort of a large number of activities which sort of use the fintech for a certain, like the digital technology, particularly for finance, so they use for a certain advantage. Otherwise, what happens is like you, like unless you are using it, let's say, for certain kinds of payments, for instance, or like particularly to your raw material suppliers and certain kinds of this whole range of the wholesalers for that matter. So that has probably helped to an extent, and many have used it for like sharing their business services, particularly sharing designs and sharing certain kinds of market information. But beyond that, I think it's a matter of convenience for the business and how relevant is that. And as Partha did mention that there is still this huge question about about 20 to 21% of the rural areas having access to internet, and within that you are referring to having a smartphone. I think we are talking as if everyone is having a smartphone in the pocket, you see. So I think we are making a lot of mistakes by generalizing certain, like a particular segment of the society when they are doing very well. So we are generalizing, thinking that, oh, the whole of India has become very smart and digitization is very much possible. I think we really have to take, and that also relates to the earlier question on local economy. I mean, what kind of roads, electricity, internet access to, have we universalized that? If the state has to play a role, I think these are the issues to be addressed first. Then comes our general assumptions about whether digitization can make us smarter than yesterday. I think I'm really wondering when our policies would actually be responsive to situations which are so stark just in front of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Keshav. There is another question on the social aspect of the informal sector. It says, would it be true to say that the formal sector employment through even reservations was historically one of the most significant avenues of social mobility for scheduled caste and scheduled tribe communities? In other words, is it more than just economic? Is this the path to modernization, to social mobility? Is there an alternative future for these, for the large number of informal sector workers, communities, to modernize, to also to transform and transition without going through the path of formalization? I don't know if anyone would like to comment on this. Or do you even see that link, or is that a bit far-fetched to make that make a direct causal connection?
Yeah, I think this is again will require a whole another, I think, session. But the relationship between the particular kind of work, the context and institutional context, and the technological context in which it is done, right? This, I think, really matters a lot for how we see it with the existing caste ideological apparatus in place. And then there is this question of changing that ideological apparatus. There are two paths to this problem. One is the modernization and the modern institutionalization of activities that are stigmatized. Of course, setting aside things like extreme forms of degrading labor, which is what, when we talk about Dalits, of course, that is the first thing that comes up, that traditional occupations are extremely degrading in their content. So there can be no argument for the perpetuation of such occupations, of such work. That obviously is the first thing to be said. But when we go beyond that, and when we talk about things that are not inherently degrading, but are stigmatized, either because they're seen as low productive, low skill, low education, old ways of doing things, whatever that is. That's where the first part that I mentioned, which is changing the institutional context, changing the technological context, becomes very important. Right? So if you imagine a clean, modern pottery workshop, you get a very different picture in mind. You have yuppies coming there to learn pottery on the weekends or something. It's the same activity, but its context has completely changed. And there are a lot of interesting ethnographic studies on leather, for example, and what happened when mechanization came to leather and factories were set up and so forth, and which were the occupations that too. So caste, the existing ideological apparatus has a lot of flexibility in assigning respect and so forth. Right? We have so many Brahmins now doing all kinds of service occupations, going door to door and cleaning people's water filters. Brahmin boys do this. Right? Now, what is this? This is not some high status occupation. However, apparently they're fine doing it. It's done in a modern context. They work for large firms that do it and so forth. So, and no doubt they carry all their caste prejudices of being Brahmins elsewhere, doing the occupations that they do. So there's clearly enough flexibility there. However, that doesn't mean, and that's because they're privileged that they're able to do it. Right? Somebody else is not going to be able to do it. So that's where the changing the apparatus, I think, is very important. So that ideological fight being what it is, a lot can be gained by modernizing the context of traditional activities. I think that's sort of the immediate policy point would be that.
There's a question from Suchitra Krishna Prasad. How would you see the impact of slowdown that the economy faced even before the pandemic on the informal economy and its capacity to move towards formalization? Who would like to respond to that?
See, I think one little distinction we probably need to make in this, that when you're talking of informal sector, let me also say Amitabh Bachchan also is part of the informal sector, you see. So we must make a distinction as to what are we almost presuming that being in the informal sector is being in a relatively lower status in the hierarchy. Not necessarily, in fact. So I would sort of think like if you are sort of clarifying that this is kind of a low income informal sector, which is often sort of, it is not by choice, let's say, these are not aspirational moves into a certain activity, like it's a distress driven low income activity where the state support has failed. So I think we have to make a distinction about that. So long as you are focusing on that sector where there is no comparable social protection, for instance, where the incomes are not regular, for instance, and varieties of like what you call property rights do not exist. So unless we sort of refer to a set like that, so we would not see much of a change. I mean, I would not think that the pandemic has made any difference. Maybe it has made things much starker than before. But in terms of the actual mobility, I would rather imagine that maybe focus not so much on employment per se. I would rather think with how strongly we can broad-base access to education. I think that would be a much better way of sort of kind of what you may call as a social mobility than actually sort of talking in terms of accessing some kind of a job somewhere for a certain income, maybe very irregular person. So I would sort of think so that to the extent we do that, maybe we have made some progress making education accessible to everyone. Otherwise, in terms of formalization, if I may take a very specific example of MSMEs and micro, small, and medium enterprises, which is one area I work a little more on that. So, like we have made a lot of efforts, in fact, particularly in the post-pandemic times, because of this huge number of informal workers who sort of worked on the road, etc., etc. Those scenes were seen, and there's a huge suggestion that formalization of these enterprises would be one major way out. And what has happened is like you have created a portal. The Ministry of MSME has created a portal. In fact, initially it was called Udyam Aadhar, Udyog Aadhar. Now it is called Udyam. And in that, anyone can actually register without paying a single pie. And so like you can sort of only have to share your Aadhar number and your enterprise, whether it is in manufacturing or in services, you can in fact register. So with that, if you think and if you celebrate that as, let's say, formalization and 1, 2, 3, 4 benefits to accrue from that, let me tell you, as we are discussing today, it is just about 14%, 1/4% of the enterprises which are registered as we are discussing here today. And many of these are actually not manufacturing enterprises, and many of these are actually relatively larger of the enterprises. So that essentially suggests that just a kind of a move of formalization as you sort of you get into the portal by sort of registering. If you think that is the way to formalize, then you have to explain why 86% of the enterprises, despite knowing the benefits that might accrue to them, they have not yet registered. So I would not think a kind of a mere discussion on registration as a kind of a what you call representing formalization, which we often talk in policy language. I think these are very problematic ways. I would rather think what kind of formal sort of institutions you are linked to. It is not enough to open a bank account, for instance. I should have enough money in that, and also I should have certain access to many of these institutions like any other, in fact. So unless we sort of work deeper into those things, we are still falling into this little trap of formalization, meaning that my name is recorded and yours is not recorded. So I don't think that's the way social mobility actually takes place.
Thank you, Keshav. I think there are more questions, but unfortunately we have reached the end of our allotted time for the webinar. I just wanted to quickly ask the panelists if they have any closing comments before we end. Anything to share, Keshav, Partha, Paromita, Amit? please.
Can I add one observation? Yeah.
Yes.
So the whole issue of platformization or digitization, mere registration does not guarantee that what kind of support or services they are getting. There is no data anywhere on that website or dashboard which will say Mr. X will get Mr. X got these services. So then we have also seen people are registered, people are coming out of that registration and all that. So it's a dynamic. So we cannot say that X is formalized, so it will continue to remain as formalized. And the closing remark, I would say actually the huge and heterogeneity of this informal sector make it impossible for designing any policy and all that. One single policy scheme will not address all the long list of problems that informal sector enterprises and workers they witness. What is more important to do some sector specific, which are those labor intensive manufacturing or service enterprises or segment which have got larger stakeholder in terms of employment, in terms of income. So let us do some prioritizing exercise, and phase wise we can think of that which are more important sector for our economy in terms of income, employment. Let's do something for that, then maybe like that we should move. Thank you.
So I'd like to thank our esteemed panel. Unfortunately, we don't have too much time. We're at the end of our allotted time. I mean, it was a very thought-provoking and stimulating discussion. I wish we could continue. And I think the participants also have more questions than we've been able to properly address. But I'm sure the thoughts and views have at least on most of the questions have of the panelists have been able to clarify and shed more light. I'd like to again thank our esteemed panel for their time and their comments and participating in this discussion, and also for our participants for their both on Zoom and on Facebook for sharing your comments and questions. And the webinar will be left open for 10 minutes after we conclude. So if any of the panelists want to type their responses to the questions that are coming in, they can do that. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.